Hi, my name is Alexis, and I'm going to show you how I made this extendable dining table with hidden leaf storage using sliding dovetails, kind of. I actually made a dining table back in 2018 using a similar concept. Everything was made out of plywood. The sliding mechanism was just strips of plywood screwed underneath the tabletop, being guided by other pieces of plywood. Even though it worked, overall it wasn't that practical. The pieces were very bulky. The overall table size wasn't as big as I had hoped. It was more of a prototype to what I have now. So I looked online through YouTube and such, and I found this video from KingPost TimberWorks, who made an extendable dining table using dovetail slides. I'll put his video link in the description if you're interested. Since I was only going to use wood that was at my local home center, I had to tweak the design a bit in order for it to work with the sizes I had readily available. So I used 3/4 inch red oak board to add layers onto a 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch thick piece of red oak, since they didn't have any material thicker than these 1.5 by 1.5 inch pieces. I cut a 45-degree bevel on the 3/4 inch board and wrapped around two sides of the 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch board in order for my table legs to appear much thicker. I used blue painter's tape to hold the 3/4 inch boards together. Then I glued the 1.5 by 1.5 red oak board to that piece. I used a few clamps to hold everything together while the glue dried. I then used a razor blade to clean up any glue squeeze out and used a palm sander to clean up the sides. I then used my table saw to clean up the other two sides of the table legs where the 3/4 inch board was not flush with the 1.5 inch board, giving the table legs a total thickness of about 2.25 inch by 2.25 inch. Next, I cut the aprons to about 3 inches wide. I'm going to be using pocket holes to connect the aprons to the table legs, so I drilled pocket holes at each end of each apron. After drilling all the pocket holes, I then installed the aprons into the table legs. As you can see, I'm using a good number of clamps and wood pieces to hold my table together as I screw them in. Once the first apron is installed, I use a piece of wood as a spacer to install the second apron that goes on the inside of that table. And that spacer piece is actually going to be used later for the dovetail sliding mechanism. In order to explain how I'm going to use dovetail slides, but not in the conventional way as you normally would, I'm going to use this screenshot from another video that shows how to make dovetail slides from Black Timber Company, which I'll also include in the video description below. He shows a great way of how to make dovetail slides as well. So what I'm going to do is actually, instead of having two separate pieces to be the actual dovetail slides, I'm actually going to split it up into multiple pieces. In terms of thickness, the outside pieces are going to be made out of 3/4 inch red oak, and the inside dovetail pieces are going to be made out of 1/2 inch thick red oak. If I were to redo this, I would have used 3/4 inch red oak for the dovetail pieces as well. I only used a 1/2 inch thick red oak because my table legs were a little under 2.25 inch, and if I had used a 3/4 inch, my table legs would need to be at least 2.5 inches thick. So I started with cutting the 1/2 inch thick red oak board at a 15-degree bevel. I know in other videos they use 30 degrees as the angle to cut these bevels, but I didn't want to potentially endanger myself by cutting that close with the size of material I used. I start off with taping up the center dovetail piece with 2 layers of blue painter's tape to add some wiggle room just in case I don't install the slides straight enough and they end up pinching somewhere. Once I taped up the center dovetail piece, I pre-drilled and countersunk each hole because these pieces are very narrow and they're very thin, so I need to make sure these pieces don't split and also make sure they grab onto as much material as it can. Once I install the center dovetail piece, I have to remove that piece in order to install the outside dovetail pieces that are going to be installed on the other apron. I do this in order to make sure the dovetail slides are aligned correctly, and I use that centerpiece as sort of a reference to the other apron. Just keep track of how you're orienting the dovetail pieces because you're going to be flipping them or rotating them depending on how you're installing them relative to the apron. So just make sure you're not putting them on the wrong side or you're drilling the holes in the wrong place. Once your dovetail pieces are installed in their respective apron, then I would test it out, make sure everything is sliding well enough, and make sure they're not pinching. But if you do end up having a tight space somewhere along the sliding, you could easily fix that with some sanding. And also, once everything's all put together and you use paste wax, it's gonna resolve that as well. Once both sets of aprons with the dovetail slides are installed, I then install the remaining aprons while making sure the aprons that have the dovetail slides are in the closed position, if that makes sense, to make sure the other aprons that are being installed are being lined up correctly and evenly spaced and as square as possible. Once all the apron pieces have been installed, I started working on the storage compartment for the table leaves that are going to be part of this table extension. If you notice here, there's a secondary piece of wood. That's there to complete the enclosure for the storage compartment. Since I guess the base needs to be secured, I can't secure it to the other apron because that one's going to be sliding outwards or sliding away from the other half, so that needs to be free. Once the table base was mostly completed, I started working on the tabletop. I just used dowels with wood glue, and here in this shot, I'm working on the table leaves for the table. I glue it as one large piece, and then I cut it down the middle later on as two separate pieces. Unfortunately, I noticed after my glue up that two of my oak board pieces were cracked at the ends a little. I fixed it using a piece of red oak dowel and a doweling jig. What I should have done was cut some grooves into the dowels before putting them in, like normal dowels. I don't know why I didn't at the time, but it's working fine now, but I think I should have done that for a little bit extra security. In order to connect the tabletop with my table base, I used figure 8 fasteners, and I used a Forstner bit to make the fasteners flush with the top of the table base. I also used a chisel to take out additional material that the Forstner couldn't get. I used about 4 figure 8 fasteners on each table side, and for the sides that have the 2 aprons, I put 2 on each apron. If you notice, there's some blue tape on one of the aprons. That's from one of the screws stripping on me when I tried installing the fasteners. I don't know why, but the wood screws that were available at my Home Depot were, I guess, not strong or not meant to be structural. I don't know if it's just the hardwood or something, but I found that sheet metal screws work pretty well with red oak. At least it did for me. None of my screws stripped, but when I used the wood screws for that size, it stripped on me multiple times. Fortunately, I was able to get most of them out, but a couple of them were stuck in the apron, so I had to use dowels to cover up those holes, as you see here. One thing I forgot to mention when building the table base, I added a secondary apron on the inside as well for the table half that doesn't have the storage compartment. Since nothing was really holding the aprons together before everything was put together, I just wanted to have additional structural support. At the time I was installing these figure 8 fasteners, I realized that the dovetail slides would get in the way of the figure 8 fasteners, so I had to shift the dovetail slides a little bit lower than they were in order to provide enough clearance for the figure 8 fasteners. Hence why you see a second set of holes here on the apron. To connect all the pieces together, I used table alignment pins, and they were installed using a doweling jig and a hammer to hammer in the pins and their receiving ends. The two main components of the table received 4 sets of table pins, and each table leaf received 2 sets of table pins. Once the alignment pins have been installed, I cut the tabletop to final width, making sure all the edges line up both with and without the table leaves. Finally, I installed a tabletop through the table base, also making sure I pre-drill as well. Once the first half is installed, I then install the second half, making sure during the whole installation that everything is as square as possible. Now all that's left is to stain the table. I used Minwax Golden Oak Stain, and I put on about 5 coats of Minwax polyurethane on the tabletop. I didn't use poly at all on the dovetail slides. I only used paste wax everywhere the dovetail slides would be in contact with each other. I needed a second pair of hands to help me put this table together, since this table is a little bit large and it's quite heavy, and this was my first time using red oak for a large project like this, so I didn't anticipate how heavy this whole thing would be. At this point, I realized there was something wrong with the sliding. As you can see here, I'm having quite a bit of trouble opening and closing it. So I figured out why this wasn't opening and closing that well earlier. So for one, this apron and the tabletop was touching around here. I guess the tabletop's a bit bowed. So I guess when you open and close this piece, this apron here actually goes underneath this tabletop, and I guess it might have been rubbing against the bottom of this tabletop here. So I fixed that by adding an additional washer to both figure 8 washers underneath here on this side to raise the tabletop further away from this apron. Another problem was after opening and closing this a few times, this inside apron was all chipped up from here to here, and I guess the figure 8 washers that are on this outside apron underneath the tabletop, I guess it's too close to this inside apron and was just cutting into this piece so much. So I fixed that by using my router with a roundover bit to take away some material, and I sanded it over, I added some stain and put some wax over it, and now it opens and closes so much better now. So in terms of the dimensions, my table when it's in the closed position is about 37 inches long by 49 inches wide, and my table leaves add about 24 inches to that length. So when it's extended, it would have a total length of about 61 inches long by 49 inches wide. So going from about 3 feet by 4 feet to about 5 feet by 4 feet. So depending on how much you want to extend your table using this method would determine how structurally stable your table would be. For my table design, my aprons were about 31.5 inches long. My table leaves are about 24 inches. So what you need to keep in mind is how much the dovetail slides are in contact with each other when it's fully extended. In my case, when my table is fully extended, it has about 7.5 inches of overlap with each other. So that 7.5 inch overlap between the dovetail slides as well as the figure 8 washers that are supporting the table base with the tabletop, as well as the table alignment pins that are holding the tabletop pieces together, I feel is sufficient enough for my needs. And I can say with confidence that this table, when it's extended, could easily support 100 pounds, maybe even 150 pounds of weight, even though I'm never going to put that much weight on this table in my lifetime. I would say if I did use the 3/4 inch material for the dovetail slide pieces, which I definitely recommend, rather than the 1/2 inch material, then that table would be able to hold easily 200, 300 pounds. But since I used the 1/2 inch material, I wouldn't exceed 100 pounds or 150 pounds, even though, like I said, I would never put that much weight on there anyway. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment or question down below if you have any. I hope what I did here isn't considered blasphemous in the woodworker community. I was just trying to make something that was within my ability with the limited tools I had, as well as with the limited resources that was available to me. So thanks again, and subscribe for more videos that will be coming very soon.